Welcome back to the Dharma Doors. I'm MC Owens. This is the San Francisco Dharma Collective, and we're going to keep reading sutras. Tonight, we're going to keep going with the sutra that we've been working on. But if you haven't been coming, it's okay, because we're just going to be talking about one topic tonight. Maybe two topics, but we're still in the Majjhima Nikāya, the middle-length discourses. We're still on sutta number 77, the Mahāsakuludāyi Sutra, or the Mahāsakuludāyi Sutra. So the main major discourse given to Udayan. So we've been talking about this sutra now for a few weeks. This is an interesting sutta, I should say, because in this section of the Majjhima Nikāya, the Buddha's been chatting to these wanderers. And I think I said this last week or the week before. What I like about this little section of suttas that the Buddha is teaching to the wanderers, what I like about them is that the wanderers, they don't know about Buddhism. And so the Buddha is sort of telling them about it. Normally, the Buddha, of course, is teaching the bhikkhus or the bhikkhunis who already know a lot about the Dharma. And so the Buddha is sort of adding to their knowledge. But these suttas are interesting because it's sort of just starting fresh. So again, if it's your first time for this sutta, this is actually going to be is this part 3, Gnome? I think, yeah, part 3. In the first session a couple of weeks ago, I actually walked us through the whole sutta. So I did the whole beginning, and then I quickly went through the end. But the end of the sutta is so full of so much good information, primarily kind of about meditation, that I said, okay, last week, let's move through it a little slower. And now tonight, if you happen to have the Wisdom Publication Edition, we are on page 640, and we're going to be talking about section 10, paragraph 24. And the Buddha is going to talk about the 10 kasinas. What's a kasina, you may ask? Well, that's what we're going to talk about tonight. At least that's going to be the first thing we're going to talk about. Yeah, so let's dive in. Let me give you a little background on this before we even read it, before we even read about these things. So if you've been reading the sutta, the last few things that the Buddha's been talking about are these kind of various, not exactly like meditative states. He's sort of been talking about different meditation techniques, such as meditating on the body of form and the world of form, and kind of having an understanding, hey, this is earth, water, fire, air. That's earth, water, fire, and air. And using that kind of view, an elemental view, to achieve a state of kind of equanimity between inside and outside, or self and other. So that was sort of one thing that we talked about last week. There was another aspect of that that we talked about. So the Buddha's getting into like some pretty like technical methods of meditation. And that's going to continue with this idea of the 10 kasinas. So a quick like background on this. So there is a very important early Buddhist text. It's not a sutta. It's not even part of the Tripitaka, at least the Tripitaka proper, the Buddhist canon. No, I'm talking about a text called the Visuddhimagga, the path of purification, as it's called. So if you don't know about this book and you've been coming to Dharma Doors, you should know about this book. It's very important. So what it is that about 900 years after the lifetime of the Buddha, so in the 5th century AD or CE, whichever you prefer, In Sri Lanka, so in the 5th century in Sri Lanka, there was a Theravadan monk named Buddhaghosa who took all of the practices and knowledge of his time, 5th century Sri Lanka, and he put it all in a systematic presentation of the Buddha's teachings. And that system is called the path of purification, the Visuddhi Magga, or Vishuddhi Marga, if it were in Sanskrit, but it's not in Sanskrit. It's in Pali, so it's the Visuddhi Magga, the path of purification. It's in the path of the purification by Buddhaghosa that you get a lot of very, very detailed information about Buddhist meditation techniques, meditative states, specific descriptions of those meditative states, things that you might see in those meditative states. And it's in the Visuddhimagga that you have a very large section dedicated to these kasinas. Now, just to mention it sooner than later, a kasina is going to be a meditative object, but it's a specific kind of meditative object. In fact, I'm going to talk a little bit about, in a little bit, I'm going to talk about the 40 Buddha-approved ayatanas, or meditation objects. The Buddha supposedly approved 40 different things that you could meditate on. The first 10 of them are these kasinas. And I've been trying to figure out what this word kasina means, and I'll share it with you in a moment. But what I want to kind of say from the beginning is that the Mahāsakuludāyi Sutta here that we've been reading, it's actually one of the few suttas where the Buddha even mentions this word kasina. The Buddha does not talk a lot about kasinas. It's in the Visuddhimagga that they talk a lot about kasinas. And then, oh, and by the way, remember, Sri Lanka is that little island south of India. So we are, if it is the 5th century AD and we're in Sri Lanka, that's a long time and a long distance from where the Buddha was. And we should kind of keep that in mind. So this is meaning that the Visuddhimagga really, really represents what was going on at Sri Lanka in the 5th century. I would not get that confused with what the Buddha taught in 500 BC Magadha in that way. Like, so as a kind of historian and scholar, I would want you to keep those things, like keep that time frame in mind. But then what you need to know is that in Myanmar, in Burma, in the mid-20th century, there was a Burmese monk named Mahasi, I think I wrote it down, Mahasi Sayadaw. I'm not sure I'm pronouncing that right. But Mahasi Sayadaw took the Satipatthana Sutta and the Visuddhimagga and sort of popularized a form of Vipassana Buddhism, or Vipassana practice. He's a Buddhist, of course. And that Burmese, Myanmar Vipassana system also uses the kasinas a lot. And it's become kind of popular in that system to use this technique. So if you've heard about the kasinas, you've probably heard them coming from this Burmese, Myanmar tradition or the Visuddhimagga. But again, it's rare that the Buddha even talks about this. I feel like we should consider that tonight. Meaning that if you've never heard of this and I've never really taught this, and we've been going through how many sutras now? Sunday night after Sunday night after Sunday night. I would not think that this is the most important thing the Buddha taught. But that's just me. So that's my big kind of like forewarning about this. let's kind of now dive deeper into this. So here we are. We're in that section on the 10 kasinas, and this is all it says. So let me read you the paragraph and then we'll chat. So the Buddha's talking to Udayan, the wanderer. He's been telling him all the teachings. It's actually one of the really beautiful things about this sutta is the Buddha basically lays out all the different teachings. Like almost all of them, actually. It's kind of an amazing Mahāsutta in that way. So, talking to Udayan, the Buddha says, and this is on the heels of telling him a bunch of other meditation techniques, he says, again, Udayan, I have proclaimed to my disciples the way to develop the 10 kasina ayatanas. So the 10 ayatanas, so they're bases, but they're kasina ayatanas or kasinyatanas. Number one contemplates the earth kasinya above, below, across, undivided, immeasurable. Another, meaning another of my disciples or another practitioner, contemplates the water kasinya, also above, below, across, undivided, immeasurable. Another contemplates the fire kasina, above, below, across, undivided, immeasurable. Another contemplates the air kasina, above, below, across, undivided, immeasurable. Another one contemplates the blue kasina. Another contemplates the, oh, and these are also above, below, across, undivided, immeasurable. Another contemplates the yellow kasina. Another contemplates the red kasina. Another contemplates the white kasina. Another one contemplates the space kasina, above, below, across, undivided, immeasurable. And another contemplates the consciousness kasina, above, below, across, undivided, immeasurable. And thereby, Udayan, many disciples of mine abide having reached the perfection and consummation of direct knowledge. That's it. That's the section on the kasinas. That's what the Buddha has to say. Buddha, what is a kasina? We don't know. Buddha, what does it mean above, below, across, undivided, immeasurable? This is where you would have to refer to the Visuddhimagga or other commentary traditions to figure this out. I've spent the week, primarily this afternoon, doing all the research I can to help us out. So I'm going to try to kind of share with you everything that I know about this. I want to let you know right away, I've never done a kasina practice. I know a lot of people who have. I know a lot of people are doing them these days, so I know it's a popular kind of Buddhist thing that's out there. But warning, I've never done this. So everything I'm telling you is sort of just information I've gathered. All right. Now, what I can tell you that's kind of very important about this, and I'm pretty sure we're going to be able to get to the next section, so allow me to kind of share that. The next section is about the 4 jhanas, those 4 meditative states. And traditionally, again, this is just the tradition that I've received, the kasinas are a technique for getting into a jhanic state, to achieving these 4 jhanas that we're going to hear about in a moment. So traditionally, these are a method for doing that. Now, I mentioned a moment ago that within the Buddhist tradition, there are 40 Buddha-approved objects of meditation. And all 40 of these, if you meditate on them, they can anchor, harness the attention and anchor the mind, and thereby get into a jhana, right? One of these meditative states that we're going to talk about. So the first 10 are these kasinas. We're going to go through them. The next 10 are the asubha, the unlovely, which are basically the traditional 10 states of decomposition of the body, the charnel ground practices that you might have heard about. Then there's the four Brahmaviharas: loving kindness, compassion, joy, equanimity. Those are also four ayatanas, four focuses that you can then move into a jhana. Then there's the four formless realms, or four formless jhanas, that are objects of meditation. And then there's one about food or sustenance, ahara, and it's kind of a meditation on food. It's actually kind of a meditation on the kind of unloveliness of food in that way. And then the very last is a kind of meditation on the elements. So those are the 40 Buddha approved techniques. You hear a lot about the 10 kasinas. You hear a lot about the four Brahmaviharas. And then you hear about the others every now and then, but those are sort of one of the popular ones in the world today. So these are all these different ways of harnessing the mind. But again, what's a kasina? Well, the word seems to mean a kind of like totality. It kind of indicates or connotes all, everything. That's going to be helpful maybe in understanding this, but then let's go a step further. So you might have noticed when I read the paragraph that the first four kasinas are elemental. So we're talking about the earth, water, fire, air as the kasina. Then there's the four colors, and these colors were introduced to us last week. We heard this progression of colors, the blue to yellow to red to white. So there's a question. Noam had a question about the relationship in the Satipatthana Sutta. So actually, let me read your question again, Noam, real quick. Yeah. So the Satipatthana is a little loose or a little short on objects, and it sort of just launches you right into jhana in that way. So the 40 approved objects, also known, are also part of this kind of more commentarial tradition. And what I mean by that is I have not found a sutta where the Buddha says, these are the 40 approved objects. No, what it seems like is that if you sift through all of the suttas, well, here he talks about the 10 kasinas. And then over here, he's talking about the 10 unlovely states of the body. And then over here, he's talking about that. And over here, he's talking about that. And so at some point, we put together a list of the 40 things the Buddha talked about. So, all right. So the kasina means all or everything. But in the Visuddhimagga, remember, about 900 years after the Buddha, down in Sri Lanka, a kasina had become understood as being a disc. So if you ask a lot of people what does the word kasina mean, they'll tell you it means a disc. I have not found that that's what the word kasina means. It's what it refers to in a lot of traditions coming out of Sri Lanka. So let me tell you about that. In the Visuddhimagga, they talk about making these discs out of clay. So literally making an earthen disc out of clay. And you would use that disc as the object of your meditation, like you might use a candle flame, like you might use a mandala. In fact, maybe this is even an early mandala in that sense. But my point is that in the Visuddhimagga, they describe making these discs or using a circular bowl of water, and therefore you have the disc of water, the surface of the water, using a fire pit, a circular ring of fire, and I wasn't able to find what the air disc would be. You could imagine such a thing, though, in a way. Or you could make a painted blue disc, a painted yellow, red, and white disc in that way. Now, a space kasina and a consciousness kasina, not really sure how we would discify those in that way. I mean, a wind or a space disc, I guess, could be like that's a space disc. So we could imagine such a thing as a space disc in that way. So in the Visuddhimagga down in Sri Lanka in the 5th century, these had become discs that you would make and that you would use as a meditation aid to bring you into a jhana, into a jhanic state. There's something very interesting about this. So these 40 things, they actually have an interesting name. They're called Kama Tahana. Tahana is like if you know the Buddhist term adhisthana, the tahana part of that, a kind of oh, even better. I know a word that you know, the satipatthana, right? The foundations of sati, the foundations of mindfulness. So the satipatthana, that word, the end of that word, tahana, is a foundation. And the 40 things that I mentioned to you are called kama tahana. Kama, of course, is this kind of sensual desire, right? This sort of sensual craving in that way, right? Kama, the realm of kama, the realm of desire. But what's interesting about the connotation that I have discovered or found regarding these 40 kama tahana, the kama part of it, the desire, it's actually about, I guess in English we would call it a disposition, your karmic disposition. Some people suffer from too much desire and greed. Some people too much anger. Some people too much delusion. Some people this, some people that. So everybody's sort of different in terms of their kama, their sensual desire in that way. And so these 40 different kama tahana are like a teacher would give you a specific thing because, oh, you're suffering with too much desire for basically sexuality. Go meditate on a corpse. That'll help. Interestingly, in the Visuddhimagga, they talk about making different size discs. For certain mentalities, you should make a tiny little disc. But for other mentalities, you should make a big disc. And that again corresponds to these sort of different mental states in that way. Sorry, just good. The colors do not go with the element. I have discovered that there was a question about, do the 4 colors correspond to the 4 elements? I thought they did too. But as I look through this more, they don't seem to correspond to the elements, or at least the colors don't seem to correspond with the elements in that way. Like the normal color for these things don't match up. Like earth is usually yellow, but yellow is not the earth disk. You probably, somebody out there is going to find a source that connects these. So put it in the chat or whatever. But my point is that I haven't been able to find a direct connection. It seems to be that there's the four elements and these four colors. Now, in mandala theory, if you study like Tibetan mandalas, oh yes, absolutely the colors correspond to the elements. But this is what I mean, that the color correspondence theory going on in mandalas is not what's going on with these kasinas. Now, there's probably a genealogy that connects them, like where there's a relationship. But again, from everything I've read about the kasinas, these are just four colors. And they do get progressively like, well, they move towards white as a kind of purity in that way, or it seems like that. Again, all of this is speculative in terms of the Buddha didn't say any of this. The only thing the Buddha said is what I just read you in that way, where there's the four elements, the four colors, space and consciousness, and then this idea of above, below, and across. So, unless there's any immediate questions about all of that, even though all of that was so wishy-washy and undecided, I really wouldn't want any questions, further questions about that. Let's dive back into the actual section, because let me kind of help you. Let me show you with how do I understand these? So I'm sort of the mind. I'm a sort of let's have fun tonight. So there's an early school of Buddhism, not the Theravada. Yeah, these suttas kind of represent the Theravada, and the Kasina practice is a Theravada thing. But there's another early school of Buddhism right alongside the Theravada, and they're called the Sautantrikas. And what that word means, the Sautantrika, it basically means the Sutra Vada, the way of the sutras. And what it is that the Theravada, so the Theras are the elders, right? And so the Theravada is kind of literally like in the Christian churches, I think they call it Presbyterianism, because the presbyters are the elders, and so the presbyters are the authority. Well, in the Theravada, the elders are the authority. You know what's the authority in the Sautantrika school? The sutras. This is the authority. I'm a Sautantrika Buddhist in that way, whereas I read sutras, and if the Buddha said it, I'm on board. Commentary from from hundreds of years later, I read it, I study it, I take it into consideration, but for me, this is the authority. So, for me, when I read this and I put it next to everything else I know about early Buddhist meditation, I want to kind of share one of them. And I want to focus actually on what would be the water kasina. I could do it with earth, I could do it with fire, I could do it with wind, but I want to focus on water. So for me, I do not read, because of the etymology, I do not read kasina as a disc. That to me seems like it was a kind of later upaya type of a thing. If you put this into context with everything actually that we've already read, so if you go back to last week, for me, the water kasina would be about a kind of meditation of mindfulness, sati, and what you would want to be sort of meditating on above and below and across, right? Undivided and immeasurably. For me, I would meditate, and this would probably be well done outside, because if you were to look up at the clouds, you would know that they are water. And then, if you were to think about it, think about humidity. Is there not water right here? It might be trace amounts of water, but is there not water right here? Ah, so if I'm looking up at a cloud, wow, that's a bunch of water. If I'm thinking about humidity, wow, that's a bunch of water. And now imagine that I were, just for fun, imagine I were sitting in front of a lake. And so there was this big body of water below, a big body of water above in forms of clouds, and water everywhere in terms of humidity. And then if you put that together with last week where you realize, wow, look, saliva, tears, water. There's water here, there's water everywhere. And so you could just attend to the water element, which is everywhere, undivided and immeasurable, both inside and out, everywhere. And the idea is that if you could attend to just the water element that is above and below, everywhere undivided, and effectively, if we put this with all of our other training, we know that we want to sort of dispense and let go of any superfluous thinking. Things about yesterday, things about tomorrow, things about whatever, just attending to the water. The idea is that through that process of just attending to the water element that is everywhere, you could then move into a jhana through that meditation on the water element that I just quickly walked us through. Does that make sense regarding the water kasina above, below, everywhere undivided and immeasurable? And again, you could do it with the solid earth element. You could do it with temperature, right? Meaning the fire element. You could do it with temperature. And indeed, you could do it with air or the wind element. So that would be my way of reading this. Now, the colors get a little trickier in that way in terms of the color blue being everywhere in that way. That does get a little tricky. But now I need to tell you about something else. This practice is often associated, and I mentioned this last week, by the way, and I just want to follow up on that. Last week, I did mention and introduce the idea of the nimitta, the sign. And the idea is that in the Visuddhimagga, again, it's not in our sutta tonight, but it's in the tradition, that when the meditator is meditating on, let's say, the water kasina that is above, below, everywhere undivided, what they talk about is the nimitta of water, appearing to the meditator. And that's where, if you go looking like I did, you will find 100 different definitions or explanations of what that means. For some people, it seems like it's some sort of like hallucination of I don't even know what, of a light or something like that. Other people, it seems like it's more of a feeling that arises. There's all different kinds of commentary, and not just commentary, but like experiential reports about this nimitta arising from doing this practice. Last week, I described the nimitta, as being like the not water but waterness, like the quality of water. And so there's this idea that that particular nimitta, which is a quality, a characteristic, it somehow appears in the mind of the meditator by doing this practice. And it's sort of an indicator that you've made it in that sense. Again, I'm sharing this because it's sort of part of the tradition, but I want to be clear, that's not in here. All this talks about is the meditator doing bhavana, and bhavana is the word for develop, at least in this translation, the word develop. So when the Buddha says, I have proclaimed to my disciples the way to develop bhavana, the dasa kasina yatana, so the 10 kasina bases. And then the Buddha just says one contemplates the kasina above and below, and that's it. But again, it would seem that this is a technique to move into the next section regarding the jhanas. So that's about all I have to say about the kasinas. If anybody has questions, comments, or ideas, I'd love to hear them. Again, it's a complicated technique. Yeah, Maria.
Excuse me. Yeah, I just want to add in a couple of details that I remember from a few years ago, and I'm sure it's still available if anyone's interested. Ajahn Sona at the Birken Forest Monastery in Canada has on YouTube a whole thing about the kasinas and meditations that go along with them. And he does an explanation of it, and there was this piece about a successful, and he makes it clear that this is like a long-term endeavor to get to this point, but that at a certain point after this like one pointed meditation on the kasina gets developed, or you get there, you start to have this super normal awareness or perception is what he called it. And the way it seems is like, it's like the way he describes it is like, things come, like if things are in focus, they come into like super focus, like you suddenly aware of all of the details or something along those lines. But yeah, like I say, it's been a while since I looked at that or thought about it, but yeah, he goes into a lot more detail about it.
Yeah. Yeah, again, if anybody out there who's watching this or listening to this is interested, there's a lot of information online about all of this. But again, as a Sautantrika Buddhist, I just want to stick to the suttas in that way. So I don't like to bring in too much commentary in that way, but I encourage everybody to do, go off and look into it for yourself in that way. All right, let's move on to the jhanas, because that's going to be much more familiar territory. I think we're going to be on much more solid ground, even though the jhanas are actually, even in a way, a much more technical form of meditation. We've been doing a lot more reading about them. So, yeah, let's do it. So this is going to be the section on the 4 jhanas. Interestingly, what does jhana mean? I will tell you, this is talk about a tricky word to find the meaning of. What's really interesting is that I know that you probably know that in the Pali language that these early suttas are written in, or at least recorded in, I should say, they're called jhanas, right? J-H long A, N short A, jhana. And there's the 4 jhanas. This sorry, one sec. Yeah. In Sanskrit, though, these are called dhyanas with a D. And if you look up do your research and look for the etymology of the word dhyana, it's a different etymology than the word jhana, even though they're supposedly just different pronunciations of the same word. So that's interesting. More research is warranted in that sense. But the etymology or the meaning of the word jhana seems to mean burning. Huh. I wouldn't have thought that, right? I would have thought more like cool peacefulness or something, burning. How does that indicate burning? Well, the connotation seems to be about burning up afflictions, burning up attachment to the world, burning up defilement, burning up all of that. And then you're in a jhana. So it's almost like have burned up. Not that when you're in a jhana, you're burning in that way. So that seems to be the etymology. I've been curious about the meaning of jhana for a while. That's what I have found. Again, if you've found something different, let me know. But we know about these. We've read about these. We read about these almost every Sunday night eventually, because the Buddha eventually gets around to teaching the jhanas. What I love about this section, though, is that this is like all for all four of them. This is going to lay out the whole imagery of the jhana. And I don't know if we've read this whole thing in a different sutra yet. So let's read the first one. Again, Udayan. I have proclaimed to my disciples the way to develop the four jhanas. Number one, here, quite secluded from kama, from sensual pleasures, secluded from akushala dharma, secluded from unwholesome states. The practitioner enters upon and abides in the first jhana, which is accompanied by applied and sustained thought with rapture and pleasure born of seclusion. The meditator makes the rapture and pleasure born of seclusion drench, steep, fill and pervade their entire body, so that there's no part of the entire body unpervaded by that rapture and pleasure born of seclusion. Just as a skilled bathman or a bathman's apprentice heaps bath powder into a metal basin and sprinkling it gradually with the water kneads it till the moisture wets his ball of bath powder, soaks it, and pervades it inside and out. Yet the ball itself does not ooze. So too, a practitioner makes the rapture and pleasure born of seclusion drench, steep, fill, and pervade the body, so that there's no part of the entire body unpervaded by the rapture and pleasure born of seclusion. All right, that's the first jhana. I want to go through it because there's key words. I want to like clarify certain key terms, and then I won't have to do it for the second, third, and fourth jhana. So let me walk you through this because I think this is really important to understand basically every word of this. So first up, how do we get into a jhana? Well, first up, we need to be secluded from kama, from sensual pleasures. So Could you get into a jhana if you were, binging a television show? I mean, the Sautantrika in me reads this and says, no, you have to be secluded from sensual pleasures, sensual desires in that way. So whether it's entertainment or food or sex or drugs or whatever, but anything from the realm of desire, the kamadhatu, no, we got to put those away for now if you want to get into a jhana. So quite secluded from those sensual pleasures, secluded from akushala dharma. So akushala dharma, unwholesome dharmas, unwholesome stuff, that's things like being violent, being angry, lying, stealing, all of the precepts. That's all the precepts are about akushala dharma, unwholesome things. So if I'm out, you know, being violent all day and angry, am I going to be able to run home and get into a jhana? No, I have to seclude myself from such unwholesome states. That's why all the shila, all the morality of Buddhism is absolutely necessary to the meditation. So, secluded from sensual pleasures, secluded from unwholesome states, a bhikkhu, a practitioner, enters upon and abides in the first jhana. What is this first jhana like? Well, it is accompanied, so when you're in the first jhana, it is accompanied by vitarka and vichaya. So it's accompanied by applied and sustained thought. So we've talked about vitarka and vichaya before, and that's, by the way, the Sanskrit pronunciation, because I'm used to the Sanskrit pronunciation. But those two ideas, which are translated as applied and sustained thought, they are two modes of thinking that the Buddhist tradition differentiates. Vitarka is a sort of scanning, a kind of awareness, a looking around. It's a certain kind of like surveying thought. Vichaya is when you have noticed something and you're going to like study it. You're going to like sustain your thought or focus on it. And so we are always sort of looking around, looking around. Ooh, what's that? Looking around, looking around. Ooh, what's that? That's vitarka and vichaya. Looking around and then finding something and then paying attention to it. And I like to kind of make it clear that these are not like technical states of mind. No, these are just how the mind works, that one part of our mind is sort of, or one way of thinking, I should say. I don't want to make it sound like it's two sides of the mind. It's just we're either kind of looking around or something has grabbed our attention and now we're going to look at it. Well, when you're in the jhana, in the first jhana, let's just for simplicity's sake, let's say that we're doing this with our eyes closed. Let's make it simple. So at that point, we're just sort of being aware of the body and being aware of thoughts, but we're just sort of observing those thoughts, right? So it's just sort of like noticing feelings of the body, but then something might grab your attention in terms of thought, or you might notice the arising of an emotional state. Maybe it's a slightly depressive state, maybe it's an excited state, whatever it is. And then you would lock your mind on that. And this is where in the early Buddhist tradition, you are advised to observe that emotion and watch it subside. And you would do that in a state of vichaya, where you are having sustained, focused attention on an emotion or on a bodily sensation or whatever it is. Now, the next part of this is that the first jhana is accompanied by applied and sustained thought, and it's rapturous and pleasurable. So we are talking about priti or piti, and we are talking about sukha, right? So not dukkha, not the suffering of dukkha. We're talking about sukha, the bliss, rapture and bliss. But this is the important part. If you really, for me, if you really want to understand the jhanas, you have to notice that the first jhana is with rapture and pleasure that's born of seclusion. For me, that is the most important part of this. So remember a moment ago I said you probably wouldn't be able to get into a jhana if you were binge watching a television show? Well, that's because when you're watching a television show, I presume you're watching it because you like to, right? I presume you're doing it because you're receiving pleasure from doing so, right? I hope there's no masochists out there, punishing yourself. So the idea is you're having pleasure, but that pleasure is from the show. Or if it's food, the pleasure is from the food. Or if it's sexuality, it's from the sexuality. If it's from whatever it is, your pleasure and your joy is dependent upon whatever that thing is. Now, what the Buddha recognized is that that kind of dependent pleasure is kind of a trap. For me, this is like the noble truth of suffering, frankly. And what it is, it's that I know it seems like pleasure derived from things. I know it seems like that's pleasure, but from the Buddhist point of view, like maybe it's pleasure, but the problem is as soon as that thing is gone, you're not happy anymore because your pleasure was dependent upon something. But you know what the real problem with that is? You've conditioned yourself to need things to be happy. That's the real problem. It's not actually that particular moment of joy and pleasure from something. It's that you have once again reinforced and reconditioned yourself to be in a position to need something to be pleasured or to be pleased, to be happy. Whereas, if you can seclude yourself from sensual pleasures, seclude yourself from unwholesome states, you could achieve, and we read a sutra a few weeks ago where the Buddha said this. I love that, the sutra we did. It's where the Buddha says, yeah, I'm talking about a much higher pleasure. And it's a pleasure that comes from independence. It's a pleasure that you get from not needing anything. The Buddha says that's pleasure. This little dependent pleasure, it's the semblance of pleasure. It resembles pleasure. But again, if you've just been doing semblance pleasure and reconditioning semblance pleasure, that's all you know. So until you kind of start practicing seclusion and getting better at not needing things, you're going to stay kind of chained and dependent and trapped to things. Or you practice not needing anything. That's called meditation. That's called sensory withdrawal into meditative states. And I know it's not pleasant at first all the time, especially if you're a beginner. I get it. I was there. But the idea is that you need to recondition yourself. And you first of all have to get used to seclusion from kama. You have to get used to seclusion from sensual pleasure. But if you get kind of practice and do the work, you eventually reach this state of the first jhana, where it is rapturously blissful. But once again, it's rapture and pleasure born of seclusion. It's coming from you being secluded in that way. And then we've read that before in many Dharma doors, but what we hadn't heard was this beautiful description of allowing the joy and the rapture to fill your whole body. I love the idea of steeping in it, right? Like a tea bag, steeping in the rapture and the pleasure until it suffuses the whole body. So I won't reread that whole beautiful description of the bath powder making a little ball fully suffused, but that's the description. All right, I think I covered all the key terms in there, but are there any questions before we move on to the second jhana? Cool. I would want to remind everybody that the little kasina thing that we did at the beginning, I want to remind you that traditionally that the focusing on a kasina is a technique that it's sort of like it's literally almost a stepping stone where you're going to use this one external object and then eventually let it go. And that's when you would get into a full jhana. So, yeah, so the etymology of dhyana, somebody asks about, that seems to be related to adhi or dahan, and it seems to have a much more of a connotation of a kind of a mental seeing, which I thought jhana was also related to the etymology of seeing, but dhyana does seem to be related to a type of seeing in that way, which kind of makes sense for meditation, of course. But again, actually not again, because I haven't said this, etymology is a tricky game. Like, you know, there's a lot of hearsay in the world of etymology. So, all right. Everybody ready to move into the second jhana? Again, udayan. With the stilling of vitarka and vichaya. So with the stilling of applied and sustained thought, the practitioner enters upon and abides in the second jhana, which has self-confidence and singleness of mind without applied and sustained thought. Also with rapture and pleasure, but now rapture and pleasure born of concentration. The practitioner makes the rapture and pleasure born of concentration drench, steep, fill, and pervade the entire body, so that there is no part of the whole body unpervaded by the rapture and pleasure born of concentration. Just as though there were a lake whose waters welled up from below. Oh, and it had no inflow from east, west, north, or south. And the water of the lake would not be replenished from time to time by showers of rain from above. But then that cool water from down below, then the cool fount of water welling up in the lake from below would make the cool water drench, steep, fill, and pervade the entire lake, so that there would be no part of the whole lake unpervaded by that cool water coming up from below. So too, a practitioner makes that rapture and pleasure born of concentration drench, steep, fill, and pervade their body, so that there's no part of their whole body unpervaded by the rapture and pleasure born of concentration. So the couple of key parts there to notice: the whole looking around, vitarka; the whole concentrating on an object, vichaya. You're done with that in the second jhana. All there is the rapture and pleasure. And it suffuses the body, drenches the body like a lake that's not being fed from waters above, not being fed from stuff outside, right? But just a cool water coming up from down below, right? So no applied and sustained thought, but this time the rapture and the pleasure, it's coming from a state of concentrated awareness. In the first jhana, you were stoked to be free of the world. Your pleasure and joy was because you were free, independent, and sovereign. In the second jhana, the rapture and pleasure is coming from a state of mental concentration. So slightly different there. Again, udayan, with the fading away as well of the rapture, a practitioner abides in equanimity and mindful and fully aware, still feeling pleasure with the body. One enters upon and abides in the third jhana. Now, in the third jhana, that's where the noble ones say, one has a pleasant abiding, one who has equanimity, who is mindful. The practitioner makes the pleasure divested of rapture drench, steep, fill, and pervade the body, so that there's no part of the whole body unpervaded by the pleasure divested of rapture. Just as in a pond, or just as in a pond of blue or red or white lotuses, some lotus flowers that are born and grow in the water, they thrive immersed in the water without rising out of it. And cool water drenches, steeps, fills, and pervades them to the very tips of their petals, down to their roots, so that there's no part of all those lotuses unpervaded by cool water. So too, a bhikkhu makes the pleasure divested of rapture drench, steep, fill, and pervade the body, so that there's no part of their whole body unpervaded by the pleasure divested of rapture. So the third jhana is this state of equanimity. When we were in the first two jhanas, there was a sense of rapture, this priti or piti. But that kind of excitement about being free of the world, that kind of excitement about being concentrated, subsides to this state of upeksha or equanimity. Now, it's still pleasurable. Remember, it's still pleasurable in the third jhana, but it's not rapturously blissful. It's pleasant. It's cool, like those lotuses, right? Drenched with the cool water in that way. We let go of applied and sustained thought a while ago, right? So now we are just in a state of feeling the equanimity and the pleasure of equanimity. And again, this is where the noble ones are like, yo, you did it. It's a pleasant abiding if you make it to that level of equanimity. Bravo. But wait, there's more. Again, Udayan. With the abandoning of pleasure and pain, and along with that previous disappearance of joy and grief, a practitioner enters upon and abides in the fourth jhana, which has neither pain nor pleasure, and a purity of mindfulness due to such equanimity. They sit pervading the body with a pure, bright mind, so that there is no part of the entire body unpervaded by the pure, bright mind. Just as though someone were sitting covered from head to toe with a white cloth, so that there was no part of their whole body not covered by that white cloth, so too a practitioner sits pervading their body with a pure, bright mind, so that there's no part of the whole body unpervaded by the pure, bright mind. And thereby, Udayan, many disciples of mine abide having reached the consummation and perfection of direct knowledge. All right, those are the four jhanas. All the way to that fourth one, which I want to point out, the third jhana is still pleasant. The fourth jhana is beyond the distinctions of pleasure and pain. That's what makes the third different from the fourth, is that total equanimity in that sense. All right, any questions about any of the four jhanas or the kasinas or their relationship or kind of anything we've talked about tonight? Hmm? Cool. Let's talk about the pure, bright mind then really quickly. So there's a lot of ways to understand that. Like, what exactly does that mean? Because I want to remind you that all four of these, the way that they were described here, the Buddha was describing something drenching the body, right? That was the idea, to have that particular whatever it was, to have it drench and steep the body, right? So all four use that same analogy. Except in the first one, right, it was the rapture and the pleasure, the piti and the sukha, head to toe, right? So it's not just like, I'm feeling good up here, but my back still hurts a little bit. No, 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 no. This is rapture and sukha, head to toe, right? And then, well, the rapture and pleasure born of seclusion, head to toe. The second jhana was about the rapture and pleasure born of concentration, head to toe, throughout, right? And then the third jhana was about the pleasure divested of rapture, head to toe, right? And so that was that not so excited pleasure, right? Where it wasn't rapturous, it was divested of rapture. And I just kind of want you to notice the sort of the emotions subsiding here, right? Where we're going from like woohoo to like woohoo, woo, woo. So there's this chilling out in that way, right? So we move from the rapture and pleasures suffusing the body till the end. It's the bright mind, the pure, bright mind suffusing and drenching the entire body. Again, without relying on commentary traditions, My experience of the fourth jhana, my experience of the jhanas, and in particular this one, the way that I would describe it, the way that I kind of would teach it, is it has to do with, or the way that I would kind of direct you, it's about this idea of the default mode way that we think, where consciousness is between the ears and behind the eyes. So I don't know about you, but for me, the default mode understanding is that my mind, which maybe isn't so pure or bright at the moment, but my mind is like somehow in there. And I don't really feel as if my mind is here. I don't really feel as if my mind is here or in my toes. Again, the feeling, even though I know this is not true, nonetheless, the feeling is that the mind is like stuck behind the eyes. I would suggest that through this jhanic process, the mind becomes purified, the mind becomes bright, and then the mind becomes suffused. That pure, bright mind is suffused head to toe. And there's no longer that feeling of being behind the eyes. Again, this is just my experience in that way, where I feel a shift of that seat of consciousness, if you want to call it that. So that's my like kind of a few things to say about the fourth jhana. So because of time, I'm not going to move on to the next section, but I do have a few more things to say. But if there's any questions or comments or ideas. Yeah, Fur.
Is the pure mind permanent or impermanent?
What do you mean by that? Like, does it last?
Yeah, once you have that experience, do you keep that
Ah,
realization?
okay. Excellent question. On that note, that's actually part of a bigger question. I mean, it's a great question, but it's part of a bigger question, which is, I would say, the relationship between the jhanas and like enlightenment. And what I mean is that, and I spoke about this a couple of weeks ago, I think, but there's a difference between like getting in and being in these states and then not being in these states. There is a point at which it is locked in. It is fixed. It is permanent, as your question would, the language of your question. But that would be the state of being an arahat, or being an accomplished one or a worthy one in that way. And you only get there through repeated exposure to the jhanas. So what I mean is that just because I feel as if I've gotten into a jhana, it was only during that time that I was there that I felt that way. And then I'm back to my kind of normal mode. But there's a way in which, again, you have to like keep familiarizing yourself with those states, and then it becomes permanent. So the tradition says so. Yeah, very good question. Any other questions, comments, or ideas about the jhanas? Cool. So I was going to say something earlier when I was describing the Visuddhimagga and the sort of more like Theravada tradition. And I decided not to mention it because, let's read the sutras. But since we have a little bit of time and I've been spending so much time in Dharma doors. Ah, Yusa had a question. Yusa, pardon if I'm mispronouncing your name. Great question. Does samadhi correlate with the jhanas? Absolutely. So the basic understanding that I have is you may have heard, it got referenced, I referenced it at the beginning quickly. Everything that I just walked us through with the 4 jhanas, the jhanas, technically by definition, mean that you are in the realm of form, the rupa dhatu. Not the kama dhatu, the realm of desire. That's the realm of television, food, and sexuality, and all of that. So to transcend that and to be in the elemental realm, that's the realm of form. And then there's the 4 jhanas. But then there's the formless realm, the arupa dhatu. And the formless jhanas are the samadhi, or are samadhi, or samadhis plural, depending on the tradition. So my understanding is that what are called the 4 formless jhanas can also be called samadhi, because they're formless and there's no subject object. Whereas in the realm of form, there is still sort of the meditator and not the meditator. Cool. All right. Allow me quickly, though, I just want to say one thing, and it's kind of about the Theravada, the Visuddhimagga, and like that whole tradition. So as many of you know, because I know many of you take, my other classes or you study with me one-on-one, and so you probably know, but not all of you would know, I usually teach like Mahayana Buddhism. I am much more personally committed to the Bodhisattva path, like personally, and I prefer to teach the Bodhisattva path, Mahayana Buddhism. And some of you out there might not even know what I'm talking about. Like, well, what are you talking about? Mahayana Buddhism and Theravada. Well, in the world of Buddhism, there's sort of this distinction made between 2 general types of Buddhism, sometimes called the Hinayana and the Mahayana, the little vehicle, the great vehicle. I kind of prefer early Buddhism, later Buddhism, or something like that. But I want to kind of share with you like an analogy that I use a lot, but I haven't mentioned it a lot in Dharma doors, and I feel obliged. I really want to mention it here. So I'm going to use an analogy. It's my analogy for Hinayana Mahayana Buddhism. And the analogy, many of you have heard this from me before, the analogy is that it's like there's this gym, like a workout, a place you go to work out, a gym. And I go to this gym, and every morning I see the same 2 guys show up. And they show up, boom, 5 o'clock a.m. every morning. And they put in a hard, hours-long workout. So it's the same gym, the same equipment, the same practices, but there's a little difference. The first person, they're working out for their health, maybe so that they look good, so they feel good. Maybe they're trying to lose a little weight, but it's for their health. And then there's this other guy. And what I learned was that that person is a doctor. And they show up every morning because they want to be as fit as possible so that they can be as of best service to their patients. That for me is the difference between the Hinayana and the Mahayana. The path of individual liberation versus the path of universal liberation. It's the same gymnasium, meaning it's Buddhism. It's the same practices, it's the same equipment. The difference is the vow, or the reason why they're doing this. Now, what I want to make really, really clear is that it is great. It is wonderful to go to the gym, to be healthy. All of the things I said about the first person are great. But there is something different going on with the other person who is doing all of the same practices, but they're doing it for the benefit of everybody. That's a bodhisattva. That's a shravaka or an arhat in that way. And again, for me, both paths are wonderful. The only thing is, and this is where I'm going to circle back around to the Visuddhimagga. When I read the suttas, all I hear is the Mahayana. I know that these are traditionally like Hinayana or Theravada suttas, but when I read these suttas, all I hear is compassion for all beings, looking out for all sentient beings, all of that. When I read the Visuddhimagga, I hear about individual attainments. I hear about fantastical experiences that you could have. And for me, as kind of my type of Buddhism, an experience, go watch a movie. Like if you're trying to have an experience, there's lots of experiences to have. So my point is that for me, again, this is Mahayana Buddhism, but a lot of the Theravada literature that is very focused on what are called samapatti, attainments, individual attainments in that way. For me, that path gets tricky, meaning the path that's focused on the individual accomplishing things for themselves, it's tricky. And again, I'm not trying to put down Theravada at all. If anybody hears that, please don't take that away from this, because I'm not saying that. I am, though, sort of really extolling the Bodhisattva for making that selfless, altruistic vow to liberate themselves and all sentient beings. The key there is they're still part of the liberation process. Whereas in the Theravada tradition, or again, the more commentarial tradition, there just is sort of a hyper focus on the individual getting somewhere. And again, that's fine, but I would prefer to sort of teach and promote that bodhisattva path. So I've been spending so much time on the early Buddhist teachings in Dharma doors that I haven't had an opportunity to sort of talk about that bodhisattva path for a while. And so because we were getting into all of this really kind of minutia of Buddha technicum, right? Kasinas and all of that, I just wanted to say all of that for me is like a Pink Floyd laser light show. It's sort of, I don't know. That has never interested me because I'm not trying to have an experience in that way. I'm trying to liberate sentient beings. So that's my sort of spiel on that. Again, I just wanted to take that moment to say that. So I appreciate you listening. We will keep going with this sutta because we still have a section or two to go. Actually, 3, 4, or 5 sections. So if you want to come back next Sunday, we're going to be talking about one of my more interesting things I want to talk about, how to make a mind-made body and move your consciousness into it. Woohoo! So we're going to talk about that next week, and we're going to finish off the sutta. So if you can make it, that would be great. Otherwise, the recordings are always up on YouTube in a few days. So thanks, Noe. Thanks, Maria. Thanks, everybody.
Well done, Michael. Well done.